The December snow fell gently across the rolling hills of Montana as 43-year-old Thomas Mitchell guided his horse along the familiar path that led from town back to his ranch. The winter air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of a peaceful evening by his fireplace, with only his thoughts and a good book for company. Thomas had grown accustomed to solitude in the 5 years since his wife Mary had passed away, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of ranch life and the honest work that filled his days. Thomas wore his heavy brown coat against the cold, his weathered hands steady on the reins as his horse picked its way carefully through the snow. At 53, he had the quiet confidence of a man who had built something meaningful with his own hands, and who found satisfaction in the simple truth that his cattle were well fed. His land was well tended, and his word was his bond. As Thomas rounded the bend near Miller's Creek, he heard something that made him pull his horse to a sudden stop. Through the soft whisper of falling snow, he could hear the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, followed by what seemed to be a woman's voice speaking in soothing tones. Thomas dismounted carefully and followed the sound toward a small grove of trees that provided some shelter from the wind. What he discovered there would change his understanding of both cruelty and grace in ways he had never imagined. A young woman sat huddled against the trunk of a large oak tree, her white dress torn and stained, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. In her arms and arranged carefully around her in the snow were 3 tiny infants, newborn babies who could not have been more than a few hours old. The woman was badly bruised with visible marks on her face and arms that spoke of recent violence, but her attention was focused entirely on keeping her children warm and comforted. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to startle someone who had clearly endured enough trauma for one day. "Ma'am," he called out gently, "are you hurt? Do you need help?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that held both terror and desperate hope. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, and despite her obvious injuries and exhaustion, there was a fierce protectiveness in the way she held her babies. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please do not hurt us. We have nowhere else to go." Thomas felt his heart constrict as he realized the full scope of what he was seeing. This woman had recently given birth to triplets and had somehow ended up alone in the wilderness during a snowstorm, clearly having fled from someone or something that had caused her significant harm. "My name is Thomas Mitchell," he said, removing his hat in the respectful gesture his mother had taught him decades ago. "I own a ranch about 2 miles from here, and I promise you that I mean you no harm. What is your name?" "Ruth," the woman replied, her voice still cautious, but showing the first hint of relief. "Ruth Patterson, these are my daughters." She gestured to the 3 tiny babies who were wrapped in what appeared to be pieces of her own clothing. Thomas knelt in the snow beside Ruth, noting how she instinctively moved to shield her children, even though he had done nothing to threaten them. "Ruth, you and your babies are going to freeze out here. Let me take you somewhere warm and safe." "I do not have any money," Ruth said quickly. "I cannot pay you for help." "I am not asking for payment," Thomas replied gently. "I am asking you to let me do what any decent person would do when they find a mother and 3 newborn babies in danger." Thomas could see Ruth struggling with the decision, weighing her fear of trusting a stranger against the obvious reality that her daughters would not survive the night in these conditions. "Ruth," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used with frightened animals, "I give you my word as a Christian man and a father that you will be safe in my home. You and your daughters need warmth, food, and medical attention, and I can provide all of those things." Something in Thomas's tone or manner seemed to convince Ruth that she could trust him. She nodded slowly, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as she realized that help had truly arrived. Thomas carefully helped Ruth to her feet, then gently gathered the 3 babies in his coat to protect them from the wind. The tiny girls were remarkably quiet, as if they sensed that their survival depended on the kindness of this stranger, who had appeared like an answer to their mother's prayers. The ride back to Thomas's ranch was slow and careful, with Ruth riding behind him and the babies cradled safely. Between them, Thomas found himself marveling at the miracle of 3 healthy children and wondering what circumstances had led to their mother being abandoned in such a desperate situation. Once they reached the ranch house, Thomas moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. He built up the fire in the main room, prepared warm blankets, and heated milk and broth while Ruth settled with her daughters near the fireplace. "Ruth," Thomas said as he handed her a cup of warm broth. "I do not need to know the details of what happened to you, but I want you to understand that you are welcome to stay here as long as you need to recover and decide what you want to do next." Ruth looked around the comfortable, well-maintained home and felt the first sense of safety she had experienced in months. "Thomas, I need to tell you the truth about my situation. My husband threw us out when he saw that all 3 babies were girls. He said I had failed him by not giving him sons, and he told me never to come back." Thomas felt a wave of anger at the kind of man who would abandon his wife and newborn daughters, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring. "Ruth, any man who would treat his family that way is not worthy of the title of husband or father. These little girls are blessings, not disappointments." Over the following days, Thomas watched as Ruth slowly began to trust that she was truly safe in his home. She was a devoted mother who spent every moment caring for her daughters, whom she had named Hope, Faith, and Grace. Thomas found himself drawn to the gentle way Ruth spoke to her children and the obvious love that flowed between them. "They are beautiful babies," Thomas told Ruth as he watched her feeding one of the triplets while the other 2 slept peacefully nearby. "Any parent would be proud to have such healthy, lovely daughters." "I love them more than my own life," Ruth replied, "but I worry about how I will provide for them. I have no skills beyond keeping house, and caring for 3 babies will make it difficult to find work." Thomas had been thinking about the same question. His ranch was profitable enough to support a larger household, and the house had felt empty and purposeless since Mary's death. More than that, he had come to appreciate Ruth's gentle nature and the way her presence and that of her daughters had brought life back into his home. "Ruth," Thomas said one evening, as they sat by the fire after the babies had been settled for the night, "I have a proposition for you, but I want you to consider it carefully and honestly." Ruth looked at him with curiosity and slight apprehension. "I would like to ask you to marry me," Thomas continued, "not because you need rescuing, but because you and your daughters have reminded me what it feels like to have a family. I can provide for all of you, and I promise to love and protect those little girls as if they were my own children." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, looking into the fire as she considered Thomas's offer. "Thomas, you barely know me. How can you be certain that this is what you want?" "I know that you are a devoted mother who would do anything to protect your children," Thomas replied. "I know that you are kind, gentle, and grateful for simple acts of decency. I know that you have brought joy and purpose back into a house that had become just a place to sleep. That is more than enough foundation for a good marriage." Ruth looked at this man who had appeared in her darkest hour like a guardian angel, offering not just shelter but a future for her daughters. "Yes," she said simply, "I would be honored to be your wife." 6 months later, Thomas and Ruth were married in the small church in town with Hope, Faith, and Grace, sleeping peacefully in a basket beside the altar. The entire community had embraced the family, marveling at the way 3 tiny girls had transformed a lonely widower into a proud father and devoted husband. Thomas adopted the triplets legally, giving them his name and ensuring they would inherit his ranch equally. He often said that rescuing Ruth and her daughters from the snow had actually been the moment when they rescued him from a life that had lost its meaning and purpose. Ruth learned that sometimes the greatest disasters in our lives are actually doorways to blessings we never could have imagined. Her husband's cruelty had led her to a man who valued daughters as much as sons, and who understood that the measure of a family is not in its size or composition, but in the love that binds its members together. Hope, Faith, and Grace grew up knowing they were treasured not just by their birth father, but by the man who had chosen to become their father when they needed one most. They learned that families are not always formed by blood, but sometimes by the simple decision to love unconditionally and to open our hearts to people who need what we have to give.